Okay, welcome to the later afternoon portion. Again, appreciate everyone's patience, and we're really excited for the last set of presentations. I know I've heard a lot of excitement so far. I just wanted to talk really briefly because I also have heard that there's a lot of big ideas and some questions about how are we going to pay for all this? That's not what we're talking about right now. But at the same time, I think one important thing about this challenge is that we really are, wanting to spend our time, as staff, as the board, the research advisors, the greater, what we've been calling Resilient by Design family, working closely with teams to come up with plans to actually make these designs once they're finalized a reality. And I think, as Hank mentioned in his talks earlier, this 3 years ago, some people came together and said, can we do this in the Bay Area? And I think for a long time, there's these questions like, we don't have any money. How are we going to do this? How are we going to make it happen? And through the work of many people in this room and partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation, here we are today. And so I wanted to really give a shout out to the Rockefeller Foundation for investing in this process and investing in this region to say, can we make this a model that works in communities that don't have a disaster? I think, can we make this investment before we have the $60 billion in devastation that we need to clean up for? And so we really have an opportunity here to show that this works. So that's very exciting. I think we are really going to be thinking carefully and working closely with partners throughout this process to figure out what the different funding mechanisms are. One thing that the Rockefeller Foundation, I think for those of you who were at our launch event in May, Sam Carter from Rockefeller mentioned that Measure AA, the Bay Restoration Measure that was passed in 2016, which is $25 million a year or $500 million for Bay restoration, that the Bay Area was willing to tax ourselves to invest in the Bay, was something that really showed them that this area is serious about taking care of our environment and taking care of our infrastructure. We've now been talking to local funders who look at the Rockefeller Foundation investment and say, that shows that this group is serious about coming up with real solutions that make a difference. So I think it shows me, and I think it shows us, that we really can come together and make this happen, make these designs happen. So we're really excited to see these next 4 teams and then partner with all of these teams in the future to come up with amazing designs based on what they're talking about today, and then also come up with ways to make them a reality. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Hassell Plus team.
Thank you, Amanda. We are the Hassell Plus team. We're a collaboration of practices from Australia, from the Netherlands, and the local Bay Area. We're very excited to be here. And I'll just introduce my colleague David Tickle from Hassell and Natalie DeVries from MVRDV, and I'm Richard Mullane from Hassell. I'll also point out there's a few hundred of our colleagues in Australia and in the Netherlands watching us online, so just keep the applause down, please. Okay, what we aim to do is to bring something of an outsider's view to the Bay and bring some insights from our experiences here on the site and our research. And then from those insights, we're going to introduce a regional concept for the Bay, but then we're going to dive into a local prototype project that we think can really deal with local issues with the community. And then from that prototype, we're going to look at 3 sites where we think it can be applied. So what are the threats? Well, the threats are pretty significant. Sea level rise is happening. It's clear that it's impacting infrastructure like rail, ports, airports, and water treatment plants. Expensive stuff all along the shoreline, as well as those communities. There's also fluvial flooding, which is increasing in frequency and in devastation along those blue areas in that middle map. And then further to that is seismic risks. So there's fault lines on the ridges that are limiting retreat up the hill for those urban settlements, and there's also liquefaction risks on the shoreline. But is it possible that the real disaster is already underway? And when we tour around the Bay Area, it's clear that a group of cities has grown into this kind of mega region, but it's something of kind of like a mega commuter region. What most people talked about as their shared experience is the time they spend in their cars on their motorways looking at the bay, which is really sad for us from cultures that really value waterfront places, and that's something we wanted to bring to this process. But also equity hasn't been an equitable sharing of that prosperity as the region's grown, and furthermore there's some limitations on the centres of community that used to be a places for people to gather have actually kind of weakened over the years. So the street retail, the libraries, the town centres, they've kind of faded, and that's definitely a problem. Who's greatest impacted by these challenges? Well, we went to a number of vulnerable communities on the shoreline. They're traditionally located on the shoreline because of that engagement with previous industry that's been gone. They don't have access to open space and recreation, and they don't have access to the sorts of community facilities they need to build social resilience. There's also the ambitious Baylands projects and the Bay Trail, which are fantastic, but they're at risk from sea level rise, and also there's something missing in that equation that kind of links those communities to that space on the shoreline. So is there a better model? It's definitely something that we've talked about a lot in this process. There's 101 cities, 9 counties. Is there a way we can turn something that we talk about as a weakness for this region into a strength? Can we use that kind of granular infrastructure of schools and libraries? Can we build on the number of communities, making a network perhaps, rather than complaining about how hard it is to organise everybody through one regional governance model? So we look across the timeline of the Bay, and there's certainly been a fair few disasters in the past. And what's been the biggest asset within those disasters? Have our needs really changed that much since 1906? And just last month, we were really interested to see how communities use spaces and systems every day, but also in disaster. And those systems are sometimes large, but they're sometimes small. They're sometimes movement systems and sometimes information systems, or just sustenance systems. And so when we start developing a concept for the Bay as a region, we start by looking at the existing pattern of development. And the Bay Trail, the Ridge Trail, the transit, freeways and priority development zones are all in loops, and they're vulnerable like a circuit to being broken, as we've heard over and over again. So what we'd like to do is to form points of collection on the waterfront for people to come together, up in the towns and at transit nodes, and up at the ridgeline. And through these points of collection, collect water, collect people, and make them points for disaster response. So we want to join them then with corridors, connectors, as we call them, giving people access to the Bay, engaging them in the conversation about how we respond to these resilience challenges, and then connecting them across to each other. So transitioning from what we call a loop into a network. And we think this is kind of key to resilience. It's key to managing existing water challenges. It's key to managing existing community capacity for resilience. But most of all, it's building a system that is less vulnerable than the current system, which we've seen so often can fail. So we talk about this collect and connect system. We talk about community using it. We talk about the advantages for water management, and we talk about disaster response systems. So we're looking at 2 scales here. We're looking at a regional platform that can create that network, but we're also looking at this prototype project. And if we dive into the existing condition, these are the types of sites that we're talking about. So we're talking about communities of concern that are on the shoreline, but they're sharing it with infrastructure and industry, and they're very tightly packed in. They're suffering from fluvial flooding along creek lines, but that's often made worse by restoration projects that are bringing rising tides closer to those communities. And they're also often just downhill from transit nodes and from town centres that were at one time, real centres of community and just need a little bit of help to kind of get back to those valuable systems that they could be. So what we're interested in creating is space. So making room for water, making room for communities, and making room for disaster response. So we're talking about making a series of spaces up the hill in the town and down on the water's edge, connecting them to creek corridors so that they carry water capacity, retention, treatment and reuse, but also connecting them to town centres and to a key street and reviving those places, regenerating them to build that community resilience.
So part of our approach is actually building a digital platform. So we need the communities, because we believe that communities themselves can help to provide programming for these collector spaces. Yes, this is just an example. So we believe actually that the intelligence of the community can produce the programs that we want to gather in our connectors and our collector spaces. There's much talked about already about communities, but I think we think that the intelligence of the communities can be used to create a quality of living. And if we connect this also to all the measurements we are taking to solve issues regarding the possible disasters and sea level rising, we will get a kind of win-win situation. Now you see here in this overview that we think about these elements in different ways. So it's the communities who can provide programs both uphill and downhill in the collectors, but we can also they can also come up with facilities that could even be shared in the whole Bay region, which is the first column. And it's about the communities, but it's also about infrastructure. It's about disaster solution. It's about education. So different levels of connection. And with our platform, we will collect these ideas and programs, and then we can turn the collector areas really also into urban labs. And so the community or communities we're looking for can be sort of the first ones and provide examples and set the tone in the development. So we've been talking about making these connectors, and we always have an uphill and waterside version. So the most important role of the collectors is, of course, making spaces where communities can meet. It's places where we can add programs for education, where we can upgrade transport by making better links to bikes, to bus systems, where local businesses can start to set up some business, where we can make learning centers as well. And during some parts of the year, of course, the collectors really are collecting the water, like they might have been doing on days as today when we have a storm. And there will be retention areas, both above and underground. But around the collectors, there will still be places to do something with water reuse. The ferry will still be accessible because in the flooded areas, there will be floating structures, and it will also be places where you can find excitement and healthy things like markets and playgrounds. And then, of course, the collectors are also an important space because the community will realize that by using the connectors, they can go uphill or downhill to spaces where solutions are in times of disaster. So maybe there will be shelters, there will be information, an escape way if you in times when you can go down to the ferry, because our connections are across of the base systems, which are always circular. So when parts of the infrastructural systems break down, we actually provide ways for people to go up or downhill whenever it's needed. And you can also get information there. And ultimately, of course, also along the public spaces that we can make, along the streets and along the water retention areas, the creeks that are renaturalized. People might also find micro-hubs of information and educational facilities, higher value public spaces, and spaces for community gathering. And ultimately, our idea is, of course, to bring the community back to the Bay.
So I'm going to talk through our three opportunity projects. As Natalie was saying, really, this idea, this system, this collection of elements, connections, and collection points, we think could be applied in multiple locations. Around 50 or so we've identified, and of course we've focused on three in particular. So I'm going to run through why we've selected those, and I guess the starting point of our thinking, because again, it's so critical for us to be thinking about those individual communities and what they would like to see in the future of those places. We're just really making a few suggestions at this point that we would need to work through with those communities. So the three opportunity places that we've looked at are South San Francisco, Redwood City, and East Oakland. And what these three places have in common, I guess, are some of the challenges that we think are particularly important or urgent. And they are around flooding risk of the foreshore, communities of concern, and often those two things overlap. Infrastructure, such as motorways and rail, that block access to the bay, and in turn block the opportunity to open up the bay edge for public use. Uphill transit opportunities, as well as uphill town centres and main streets, which effectively have been through a period of decline. So firstly, looking at South San Francisco, self-proclaimed as the Bay's industrial city. The main street of Grand Avenue runs east-west through this place, westwards into the hillsides, which were once spotted with cemeteries, eastwards to the industrial waterfront, a place which has been undergoing quite interesting change, particularly more recently. So this area has major flood issues. It has a downtown and an identifiable main street, which has gone through some decline over decades, but is undergoing a revitalization program currently. But one of the key issues here is that connection to the waterfront from the main street, particularly with the impact of a few pieces of infrastructure coinciding, rail and motorway in particular. So within our thinking, we see a future, I guess, where that main street and other street connections are revitalized and reconnected to the waterfront. We've expanded space along creek lines, and that's for ecological as well as social program. And thinking about what that program could be, I guess we're thinking about the industrial spaces, how they could be retrofitted or augmented with community program, with more ecological ideas for water treatment and water collection. A resilience learning center, a focus around education spaces, whether that's formal schools or informal learning spaces. And then thinking about the future of Grand Avenue, the potential for local enterprise, local artists to start filling empty shop fronts, to start occupying blank facades, to embed digital as well as ecological infrastructure within the streetscape itself, and potentially to bring transit back to that important local connector for that community. And then looking at Coleman Creek, where it hits the foreshore, creating a large open space which can be flooded regularly if that's what happens, but then also creating new pedestrian and cycle connectivity, new spaces for learning, whether it's a magnet school or informal outdoor classrooms really based on the ecology and the water functioning of that place. So secondly, Redwood City, claimed to be the oldest city on the peninsula, established, as you can tell by the name, for the forest industry, at that point between the waterfront and all the trees on the hillside. So critical point in that kind of transfer of the resources onto the water. So again, a place that's highly vulnerable in terms of flooding, a revitalizing downtown area which is disconnected from waterfront because of infrastructure and industry as well. So we would look to build on historic streets, in particular Broadway, which links to the bay itself, being able to unlock greater public space at the bay edge, but also linking into the hillsides, I guess to deliver people to that natural amenity, but also as disaster response. What we've indicated here, as well as in the other locations, as well as the idea of sending and receiving areas. So the sending area around the downtown, which could be regenerated in some way, the creation of finance, which is then invested in the receiving areas, so creating that new public amenity, new public space and infrastructure. And in terms of some of the program, again, the idea of water, perhaps in this location because of the interesting water temple idea on the hillside. Perhaps there's a modern day interpretation of the water temple. Perhaps a collection of cultural and artistic spaces, which is more relevant to this area. But then also the idea of the waterfront being inhabited by family groups and community groups as well. In the town centre, we're thinking a new station plaza, one that's embedded again with technological and ecological systems, a shoreline park, which extends that water edge connectivity for cyclists and walkers, fields that can flood but can also be used for community sporting events, for picnics, for food-based festivals and other events. Again, bringing people to the waterfront and helping them to engage not only with the water but with each other. And then thirdly, East Oakland, a place that's undergone huge change, particularly social change over the last century. Once had a system of creek lines that have now been altered, somewhat destroyed by infrastructure and industry as well. Again, similar challenges to the other two locations, significant flooding areas, connectivity problems, a lack of open space along the water edge in particular, but also in the upper areas of the hillsides as well. So we see that there's an opportunity for a number of urban connectors from the communities to the waterfront, the opportunity to open up significant areas of open space around that waterfront and to continue some of the connectivity systems that are occurring on the eastern side of the bay, such as the Bay Trail. The programs here, again, very much focused on community need and to be co-designed with the community themselves. We think there's some great opportunities here around food, production, as well as distribution. Possibly harking back to the cultural history of that place as the fruit orchards and fields of this area. So spaces along the waterfront where community engagement and greater connectivity for cycling, walking, potentially a new ferry connection linking to the rest of the bay, but then along creek lines as well. Again, some of those food-based, community-based activities and events which could occur. And so we thought we would, wrap up by talking about, again, this idea that these places can start small. They can be informal, community-led, community-focused. We're really interested in this idea of creating proactive and very optimistic engagement with people to start with temporary, small scale, and then to build to the larger regional scale, and to really think about many of these projects as experimental, innovative, new models of not only creating things, but working with people and different organizations. And looking not only to communities and to government, but to looking at a whole range of other stakeholders and participants in the process, particularly thinking about where funding sources may be through FEMA, through Caltrains, through water infrastructure and disaster relief funding, which could be unlocked and redirected towards, more of a community outcome as well. So ultimately building that idea of this network of communities that are brought together by this idea of connecting and collecting people. Thank you.